Okay, last time we worked on our heart rate application a little bit more, and we looked at a case where the user enters information in from a form. That data from the form is submitted to another page, and the results are displayed on the other page. So I've already downloaded that application, and I've put it in the web server's root folder, which on my machine is CINET-pub www root. So, oops, I didn't mean to click that. Click this. So there it is in CINET-pub www root. Now we're going to run it and refresh your memory about what it does, and then look at an alternate way of doing it. So we go here, type in localhost. And it doesn't know that we're not Googling localhost. So we have to type in http://localhost. There we go. So we did this last time, and one of the key points was the way that the functions were broken down, where each one did a single purpose. None of them were very long, and none of them depended on anything from the outside. That is, everything that the function needed to do its job was passed to it via an argument, and the answer was returned as a return value. So we did this. Put in the age of 44, beats per 6 seconds, 10, calculate. Oh, this is doing the postback as well. Well, the example we went over last time, it took us to a second page. All right. In this example, what we're going to do is show you how to keep it all on the same page so that it does exactly what we did here. We put in our information, let's calculate. Oh, it did take me to a second page. What am I thinking? This is too early in the morning. All right. Yeah, it does take us to a second page. How do I know I'm on the second page? Well, the URLs are different. This says check range, and this one said calculator. Also, the form is gone. Now, the rest of well, I think what threw me is the rest of the page looks the same because I used all those include files. All right. So that's what we did last time. We have a form, enter data into it, hit the submit button. We go to another page to show the results. Now, another way to do it is to stay on the same page and show the results on the same page. And maybe it's deceptive to say stay on the same page, because we actually don't stay on the second page. We do go to a second page in a sense, but that second page is the same as the first page. All right. In other words, we make two requests to the server. We have the initial load of the server, and we have the load, we have the request to the server where we have entered data in and press submit. And again, how do I know that that's a different request? Look at the URL. The request is different. In this case, we have data from the query string as part of the request. So, but both of them are going to the page calculator postback.php. Let's go over that again. I go to the first page. This is my URL. So this is request 1, the initial load of the page. We go to that page. Now, I enter the data. click submit. Notice the URL has changed if I can get all these things out of the way. The URL is now this. So these two are different requests. They both request this page, but the difference is in the second time, after I've entered in data, there's stuff on the query string. All right. So essentially this page here has to operate in two modes. It has to operate in the mode of the very first time we go to the page and have not entered any data yet. That's what we get if we click the link to go to it. That's the first time we go to the page. So that's the initial load. After we enter data into it, we go to the page again. That is the post back. In other words, we send it back to the same page, but it is a total separate request. And what's different from the request is there's information on the query string from the form. So the data that we entered on the form gets passed to it on the query string. Okay, so this page has to operate in two modes: initial load and post back. How is the program going to know if it's the initial load or the post back? Pretty simple. It will look for stuff on the URL, stuff on the query string rather, as part of the URL. And we could do a number of different specific tests, but we can actually check to see if that button was clicked. Because on a form, if you click a button, a submit button that is, the name of that button will be on the query string along with the value of the button. So in this case, the value of the button isn't just what's displayed on the button, but that will get passed on the query string along with the name of the button. So I'm going to test to see if BT submit equals calculate. And if it does, I know that is a post back. So there should be other data on the query string. I should take that data, do my calculation, and go from there. Then, of course, each subsequent turn is a post back too. So if I say I'm 33 and heartbeat was 15, oh, I'm above the optimal heart range. If I put garbage in here, I stay on the same page and display the errors so that I can correct them. In the other method, I put garbage in here, I go to a second page that says age is not a number, beats are not a number. But first of all, I may forget what I entered, and it's like, I swear I typed a number in there, and I might be confused. All right. And I would have to hit backwards or click on this again to go back to the page to re-enter it. And that's asking the user to do something. I think we can agree the much better user experience in this case, as it is in most cases, will be to do a post back. So that we enter bad data, we stay on the page and they can correct it. We enter good data, we stay on the page and display the result. Okay, so let's look at how this magic happens. So I'm going to go in and edit that form. Calculator post back. Open in Visual Studio Code. And It's going to have all the include files that is needed to do the whole job. In other words, if we remember before, calculator didn't need the heart ink, but check range did need the heart ink. So we're putting in the heart include file in this one because this is going to do both jobs. It needs the heart include file if it's actually going to do the calculations. If it's the postback, it doesn't need it if it's an eventual, if it's the initial load, but hey, it's there. All right, I have my JavaScript code. And again, I wrote this deliberately to not do all the validation JavaScript wise, because I wanted to demonstrate how JavaScript can perform some validation, server-side code can perform another. Now, in this case, keep in mind, this is an example, all right? We could actually perform all the validations that the server side does in JavaScript, but that's not always the case. For example, if you enter a credit card information, call has to be made to a credit card service to validate that that's a valid credit card number, that is not reported as stolen, that the little security code matches, that the expiration date matches, that the credit card is not over its limit, has to validate all those things. That can't be done. That communication can't be done. And even if it could be, you wouldn't want it to be done on the client side where people could possibly manipulate it. You want that to occur on the server. So this sort of simulates that by saying some of the validation we're going to do on the client, some of them we're going to do on the server. So I have my include for the header and include for the nav. I have two variables. I set up two variables, one for age and one for number of beats. And if it's set, if text age on the query string is set, what that means is if it has a value, then I'm going to store that value in the variable age. Otherwise, and we're going to store the number of beats in the variable beats. Now, what does that mean? That means in the initial load, we initialize these to empty strings. If it's a postback, we set those variables to the value that we get from the query string. We could actually do get here instead of request, by the way. But I usually use request because request finds it whether it's on the query string or part of the form collection. So PHP has these two variables that are either empty strings or they are the value that we pull from the query string. Here's our form tag, and it looks like before, except the action is different. The action is this page. The action is itself. So we are calling back itself and using the method of get. So we're passing the data on the query string. I generally do that so that the data is visible as I'm going through these examples. In a real situation, you would have to decide what the best way is to pass it. If it was something that was secure, you wouldn't want to pass it on the query string. All right, let's look at this. And again, when we look at an instruction in here, we have to consider it in both modes. All right. This is my regular input tag, but looky here. For the value, I say echo age. What is that going to do? Well, if the page is first loaded, age is an empty string. So this text box is going to get a value of an empty string. All right. If it's not the initial load, if it's a postback, age, the variable age is going to be the value on the query string of txt age. And we're going to plop that right here, smack dab in the middle of that input tag. So we're going to give it a value of the value that it was on the previous page. Let's demonstrate what happens if we get rid of this. And let's explain why it works the way that it does. I type in person is 22 and the heartbeats are 10 beats per second. Calculate. Tells me I'm in an optimal heart range, but it blanked those out. Why did it blank those out? It blanked those out because this is a brand new request. And therefore those text boxes get the default value all over again. Well, when I cut out that code, I have not specified a default value, therefore its default value is an empty string. So that's why I have to go in and put in the default value to be the value of this variable age, which again, as I stated, it's going to be the empty string. If it's the initial load, it's going to be the value from the query string if it is a postback. Let's do this again. I type that in. Well, that's a really fast heart rate. I'm above the optimal exercise range. So now we can see, because if the way it was before, think of the user's confusion if they thought that they typed in 10 and they actually, entered it incorrectly and entered in some ridiculous number. They would see that they're outside of the heart range, and yet they wouldn't see what they entered back in. That way, if they made a typing mistake, it wouldn't be obvious to them, gee, that this is sort of an erroneous result. But again, a better user experience would be to show what was entered in. So the user can then say, oh, okay, I'm above it because I goofed up and I entered in way too high a number. I meant to enter that. And bam, you're in the exercise heart range. All right. This is a use of functions to make our code tidy. All right. If request submit is set, what does that mean? That means, does this variable on the query string have a value? Or does it appear on the query string? And that's a submit button. Well, again, two possibilities, the initial load and the postback. In the initial load, there is no button submit on the query string because there's nothing on the query string. On the postback, button submit does have a value. So this is only going to do the validation if the button is on the query string. If you didn't do the button, if you didn't test this button and just did the validation, then it would tell you that you haven't entered in an age and a heart rate, even though you have just loaded the page. Like, it would give you that error as soon as you clicked on that link, because it's going to look and see that that's an empty string. If we didn't do this test. So this says only validate the page data if it's a postback, because a postback is the only time that there is going to be data. Now, if we do the validation and it's valid, we're going to display the output. All right. So let's recap how we've gotten here before we look into the detail of these. Our page loads, we display the form always, and the form is either empty if it's an initial load, or it contains the values from the query string if it's a postback. Now we're going to look to see, hey, if the button was clicked, we're going to do validate form, and if the validation was valid, we're going to do display output. Now this is a case I put this in an include file, but you really don't need it in the include file. All right. And why is this? And why do I say that? Why do I say that it really doesn't need to be in an include file? It doesn't need to be in an include file because this code the code that validates the form and displays the output is specific to this page. It's doubtful we would ever have an instance to reuse that code. So if there's really minimal chance of us wanting to reuse the code, then it might as well be in the same page. It doesn't need to be an include file. But guess what? I put it in the include file anyhow. So let's look at the include file. It's not what I wanted. Oh, I want to check range INC. Remember, I'm going to say this every week we talk about these include files. It would be better if you named the include files .php instead of .inc. That poses a potential security issue to call them INC. So this is an old example before I understood that was the case. And as soon as someone enlightened me to it, it's like, oh yeah, of course it would. All right, this include file has our two functions. And again, we could just as well paste this into our page and not have this include file. These functions are not going to be, I'm not going to worry about some of the criteria for a good function within these functions. Why? Because these functions are meant to be specific to this page. Therefore, I don't care if it's reusable or not. If I'm going to do calculations on another page, I'm not going to reuse this code anyhow. So therefore, I'm not worried about it being reusable. I know that sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. In one breath, I'm saying, make sure your functions are self-contained, that everything they need is passed in as an argument, and they return their one single answer. That's true for functions that you intend to reuse. For functions that are sort of a glue, that are specific to a certain page, then that isn't the case. You don't need to follow that particular rule for a good function. All right, so what's validate form do? It assumes that the form is valid. It's just easier to write the code this way. It grabs the age and the beats from text age and text beats. And it does some tests. Now again, we would never do something like this in a function we want to reuse because we don't know if that data is coming from the query string. That data could be coming from somewhere else. But because this include file is sort of married to that web page, it's connected, all right, they go together as a pair, we're going to go and this is allowable to pull it right from the query string. So we do a number of tests. If age is not set, so if there is no age on the query string, then it's false. There's no value for age, and the valid function becomes false, or the valid Boolean becomes false. If beats are not set, same thing, no value for beats, and the form is not valid. We test to see if it's numeric, and if it's not numeric, for age, it's not valid, and we display that error message. And then finally, we look to see if the beats is not numeric. And if it's not numeric, then the page is not valid. So we display these error messages depending on exactly what is wrong with the form data on the query string. And then we return the variable valid. So that variable valid is either going to be true or false. All right. If it's false, we're done. We don't go and actually do the calculations because the data was not valid. We've already printed our error messages, and that's all we need to do if the data is not valid. If, however, the data is valid, if it passed all these tests, then we want to go and actually do the calculation and display the output. So, display the output consists of getting the age and that for beats from the query string again, calling the in-range function, which, if you remember, was in the heart include file. That we've documented, takes the age, takes the number of beats, how many seconds, and it's going to return one of three values. -1 means it's below the range. Their heart rate is below the range that's acceptable for exercise. 0 means it's in the range. +1 means it's above the range. So we call that function and get the result. Based on the result, we display the kind of message we want. This is a little tricky, I know, because this starts in one PHP tag and it ends in the other. And in between, we have the HTML. You don't want to pop in and out of the PHP like that. You can make this an echo and echo this string. That's Postback in a nutshell. All right. The key points is the page is going to work two different ways. It's going to work one way if it's the initial load. It's going to work a second way if it's a postback. And by postback, I mean it's a form that calls itself back, has itself as the action of the form. It's always going to display the form with possibly some of the values filled in if it's a postback. If it's a postback, it is going to validate the form data and then display the output. If I were doing this over again, I'd make a couple of changes. All right. That I think might make it, that would make it a little better and a little clearer. I would, of course, change all these INC files to PHP files. Again, that's done for security reasons. As an include file, there is an unlikely but possible chance that if a hacker were to know the URL of the include file, they could see your code. So for example, I'm going to take heart.inc. Very good. this has the security measures to prevent that from happening. If you did not have that security measure, then it would possibly display the code. So IIS is configured well to not allow those to be displayed. So we don't have a particular security issue in this particular case. But I would do that anyhow, just in case the web server wasn't configured correctly. I wouldn't want users to be able to see the contents of my include file. So that's one thing I'd change. Second thing I'd change is I would not use this check range include file. I would just put this code sorry about this. I would just put check range inside the HTML of calculate postback. Why do I do that? Because again, as I mentioned, this check range code is tied to this web page. It's not meant to be reusable. Therefore, not all the criteria of what's a good function applies in this case. So I wouldn't worry about it. But I made it in an include file. All right. It's better for me to say that it would be better if I did this in this case, and if I said if it's in an include file, make sure that it works generically. That is, it gets everything it needs from the arguments and only returns a value, and it doesn't output anything directly to the page. And if it's part of the page and it's tied to the page, then it does not have to have that characteristic. Any questions about this? Yeah, go ahead. Even though the data is on a post query string is not available, does the postback still work? Absolutely. In fact, I could probably change this and get it to work. I change this to post. Off the top of my head, this should still work. All right, it still works, and notice that it is nothing on the query string. It's sent as part of the form collection. So yeah, it still works. Now it still works is predicated on the fact that I am using underscore request here. Underscore request works whether it's on the query string or part of the form collection. So let me put some comments in here. This works post or get. I have options on how to get from the query string or the form collection. I can use either request where it will pull the data from both places. I can use the dollar sign underscore get. That will only work if I'm using the get method, and post only works if I use the post method. So if I coded it this way, it would still work, but I would have to change my code to use, if it previously used get, I would have to change it to use post. That's one reason I use the request, is I can switch back and forth and there's no real impact on the way that works. Other questions? All right, let's take a preview of what we're going to cover next. Or rather, let me double check what we're going to cover next. Oh, stand corrected. We're doing something else next week. Unless I change my mind. Let me do this. Let me talk about the two things that we're going to cover between now and the end of the semester, and I'll have to decide which order I want to cover them in. All right. One of the key reasons that we do server-side scripting is to interact with databases. That is something that is very impractical, if not impossible, to do on the client side. And it's not desirable even to do it on the client side. We want our database to be safe, and therefore we want to be the only ones that access it on the server. So a lot of server-side scripting, a lot of server-side code relates to interacting with the database. And I've added this into the class, I don't know, a semester or two back, and it seems to go pretty good, because without it, I think it's hard to tell like what's good about server-side scripting. All right, because really this entire example we could have written entirely in JavaScript. All right, there's no reason that formula for calculating your exercise heart rate, I mean, you can Google it and find it in a million places. All right, it's not proprietary, it's not my invention or anything like that. That formula, in fact, there's other formulas, but the basic formula for doing it is found anywhere, so it's not a secret or anything. So therefore, security isn't really an issue for that. But we pretended like it was, and pretended that this needed to be done on the server side, because we were learning about server-side stuff. And we wanted to start with something simple, so we didn't just jump right into something complicated until we had a little bit of time to go over server-side stuff. All right, now that we've had our time to go over server-side stuff, we're going to move into databases and database interactivity, which is, again, a major use of server-side scripting, right? Because that has to be on the server side. All right. So I hope that will give you a greater picture. The other thing that we're going to cover is Ajax. And Ajax works like this. Or let me reword it. This is an example of Ajax. I go in and I type H. All right. We get the list of the most popular things that start with H. The 10 most popular things. Hulu. A song, how many ounces in a cup? Never heard that one before. Home Depot, HBO Max, Huntington, Hotmail, Hobby Lobby, Harbor Freight Tools, herring and the meaning of herring. Those two are surprising. I don't know why, but they are. Now, if I continue to type, it refines it. Now notice it only shows me like 10 or so. You know, maybe 10 exactly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so it shows me the 10 most popular. Because again, I wouldn't want to see a list to scroll through of every single search term that starts with an H. All right, I type in H, T, okay. It's going to show me HTML, HTTP, HTML table, HTEAO, which I have no idea what that is, HTML color codes, and more stuff. Type in M, and it refines it until we get what we want. Now, if we think about this, I hope it's clear to you that this could not be done exclusively client side. Because in order for this to be done client side, it would have had to download JavaScript that interacts with Google's databases to provide us with a list of search terms, right? Because I can type any old things in, you know. I type in C, L, E, and it shows me. It doesn't matter what I type in. Helsinki, H-E-L-S, and so on. So it's not like it only works for a few things. It works for anything I type in. So that's a database. That's a job for a database. All right. And as we talked about, that can't possibly be done on the client side. So that aspect has to be done on the server. And yet, notice how we're getting data from the server without refreshing the whole page. So I type in a Z, E. Let's see how long it takes to get Zellers. Zellers Beach. All right, in Marblehead. All right. This page is instantly being updated. And it's doing it without refreshing the whole page. How do I know that? I don't see a little flicker in the page. Like when I refresh the page, usually I can see a little flicker like that. I can see usually on the status bar that it's reloading something, but it's not doing that here. The URL's not changing, so it's not calling the server. I don't get the flicker. I don't get that. So this makes it look like it is being done client side. So we have, if all you knew was what we've covered in this class so far, this would seem confusing, how this happens, right? And what's actually happening is there's a piece of the job done on the client side and a piece of the job done on the server side. And the term that means getting data from the server without refreshing the entire page, that technology is called AJAX. All right, so we'll be covering that. All right, because we could very easily do what we did with the heart rate calculations as AJAX, where we made a request to the server, get the answer, and then use JavaScript to display the results on the page. So those are our two topics I want to preview with. We have 4 weeks left, right? After this one. So I don't know, 2 on each, 1 on one, 3 on the other. We'll have to see how it goes. All right, are there any questions? Okay, that's all I had today. We'll either see you in lab or we will see you next week.